Hello, economics students, and welcome to Unit 4, Outcome 2, the very last outcome for VCE Economics. Well done, you made it this far. Now, in this particular outcome, I always tell my students to do this very silly thing to get started when we're thinking about aggregate supply policies. You need to take your aggregate demand hat off, which is all to do with demand, monetary policy, spending, saving, and put on your aggregate supply hat, which is all about businesses and their ability and willingness to produce. So that's what we're thinking about. How do these policies help Australian businesses produce more stuff? That's what it's all about. So, whatever silly thing you need to do, you need to shift your thinking. Now, the first thing is that the aim of all aggregate supply policies is the same in that they are all, oh God, in that they are all designed to increase the productive capacity of the economy. Okay. Now, all of these things are saying the same thing. In increasing the productive capacity, we're really shifting this thing that we learned way back in microeconomics called the PPF. We're really shifting it outwards, which means our businesses can produce more stuff. Some economists say it increases the potential output of the economy. Some economists will draw an aggregate supply curve, including you. Some teachers will draw an aggregate supply curve. And some will just talk about the ability and willingness of businesses, Australian businesses, to produce at any given price, which is the same as drawing the aggregate supply curve. Now, it's up to you how you think about aggregate supply policies. All these dot points here basically mean the same thing, but I think having all 3 or 4 gives you a little bit more color, a little bit more flavor about what's going on. Now, if we were to draw the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, you can see here, which I think you should, by the way, you can see here that all aggregate supply policies will shift the aggregate supply curve outwards. So it's not like aggregate demand policy where sometimes you'll try and shift it to the right, sometimes you'll try and shift it to the left, depending on how the economy's going. It is, what's going on here? Sorry, I've got new software here. I'm not sure what's going on. All aggregate supply policies do the same thing. They're all increasing the potential, the capacity, or the ability and willingness of businesses to produce. And why they're so important is, as you can see here, can't get my pen anymore. Oh my God, that's annoying. That's the stupidest piece of software ever. Is that they decrease the price level or inflation, they increase real GDP, and therefore they create jobs. So the magic of aggregate supply policies. But there are some weaknesses. The first dot point for your study design is you need to understand the use of aggregate supply policies to complement aggregate demand policies. So it's working together to promote non-inflationary economic growth over time. Now, the first thing we need to think about is remember aggregate demand policies work, policies that should say, in the short term, and it's all about spending. Aggregate supply policies work, however, in the longer term, and it's all about businesses and their willingness to produce. But it's the interaction of both monetary, budgetary, and aggregate supply policy which ultimately determine whether we achieve our goals. But in this outcome, we're just focusing on aggregate supply. So the reason we need to work together is that in the short term, aggregate demand policies might actually stimulate the economy, create jobs, and improve living standards, but they'll put pressure on inflation, which we know is happening in the economy right now. So in order to achieve that strong and sustainable growth target, we have to be increasing the capacity or the potential or aggregate supply curve in order to achieve strong and sustainable growth in the long term. Okay, so we have to have both these things working together. Now, I'll show you this on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. Remember, if the RBA was trying to stimulate aggregate demand, which they're not at the moment, but if they were, then this would be great because it would create jobs and real GDP, but it would create inflation. And if they had to continue to stimulate aggregate demand, as we got closer towards capacity up here, we would just get inflation and no more growth. Okay, so we'd get stuck. Now, the only way to combat this is to improve the capacity of the economy, to shift the aggregate supply curve outwards. And you can see, as I've done in the previous slide, that puts downward pressure on inflation, helps us to achieve our inflation goal, but also our full employment and our strong and sustainable growth goal. So the other amazing thing about aggregate supply policies is that they all help to achieve all 3 macroeconomic goals. So there's no pressure on inflation, no trade-off. They achieve all three goals. All right, so that's the introduction for aggregate supply policies. We'll get deeper in the next video. Sorry about my software, and bye for now.